core tech. Docker was the core tech behind .cloud, and they found it so useful themselves. They said, well, what if we open sourced the core engine of .cloud to the rest of the world, just as is, versus wrapping a platform as a service around it. And so that's what led to Docker. It was rewritten in Go because I think it was actually Ruby on Rails before, or Python before. So it was rewritten in Go and open source in 2013. And it was just very, very early. It was very exciting because we could see the downloads of the Docker engine just going through the roof. And we could see that we were really onto something. But we were still figuring out, like, okay, great that we're having all this open source adoption, but we need to create a business around this downstream. Um, we started ideating, and eventually June 2014 launched Docker Hub. So kind of a complementary service to the core Docker engine itself. And so it was a very exciting time to figure out, okay, what is the complete suite of things that we can build into this platform for developer experience? And then what is the commercial aspects of it that downstream from the open source we want to set up to monetize and grow a sustainable commercial business from there. The rest of the company, so much so that they changed the name within 6 months. They changed the name in the autumn of 2013 from .cloud to Docker, and set about selling off the PaaS business. And on top of that momentum, raised a Series A from Greylock in January 2014. So the takeoff of the open source project, that it was really solving a very critical problem, was
contributing back in open source? Because I remember, like, when we were doing Conductor at Netflix, companies like Tesla, GitHub, like, Swiggy, there's a ton of these companies, JP Morgan, they all started to come in and contribute. And
all being done in the open. It was development or building in the open on GitHub. And so you could see the GitHub participants and contributors jumping in. You could see the stars going up. Um, you could see just the word of mouth. Like, the team was tiny. There was very little there. I think we had one marketer at the time, digital marketer, and he was fantastic at creating kind of technical demos and examples. But the word of mouth is just off the charts. And layered on top of the very disruptive change of a divestiture and a recapitalization, layer on COVID, which came 3 months after the pivot of the company, right? So a lot of external pressures on the company and employees, and I give the team so much credit for powering through that. But to your question, yeah, we reset the values of the company. We stood back and talked with the employees, because a lot of pain when you go through a divestiture and you wipe out everyone's stock and you reset. Um, and we talked about what values we wanted to embrace. We changed the name from values to virtues. We made it really clear that we were going to focus on developers, and so instead of customer obsession, which was the first draft of that virtue, we tightened it to developer obsession, right? Just made it really clear that this is going to be the North Star of the business. Anything, any feature or capability that was directly developer facing, that the vast majority cared about, that would continue to be open source. And this
This is a conversation with Scott Johnston. Scott was most recently the CEO of Docker, one of the most important and beloved tools in modern software development. He joined Docker early as a VP of product, later became Chief Operating Officer, and then led the company as CEO through one of its most critical transitions. During his time as CEO, he's helped significantly grow Docker's revenue and expand its reach within the global developer community. He's helped reshape Docker into the developer focused platform it is today, loved and used by millions around the world. Scott, it's a real joy to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Drew. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
all right, Scott. So let's, with Docker, let's start off with the very, very basic question. Talk to our audience about, like, what are containers?
Sure. Containers are isolated runtime environments that are built on what's called a copy on write file system, such that they're portable. And what that means from a developer experience standpoint is that you can build and run a container locally, and without changes, deploy that container to a VM in the data center, to a cloud node, and it just works. And so, standing back, it was designed by Solomon Hykes, the founder of Docker, to eliminate the works on my machine type finger pointing. That once you define the container, define the environment, and build it and run it, it'll run the same way without changes anywhere. So our shorthand for that was build, share, and run any application anywhere without having to change anything.
Got it. And how did this word, the container term, get coined? Like, my belief is that this came from the shipping industry, the logistics world. You have some ideas on that, and why did the analogy came from the come from the shipping industry?
Sure, sure. And we can delve into the container technology, which goes all the way back to BSD days, right, with Bill Joy. But the near term or the medium term history was there's a very famous book called The Box, which talks about how the shipping containers that you just described that we see on ships and planes and cranes, how before that was standardized in the late 50s, early 60s, the cost of shipping in a logistics in sense for the total cost of product constituted like 30% of the overall cost of the product. And that's because moving products around at the time was very manual, right? And you'd have like bananas sitting next to anvils, sitting next to cars, sitting next to oil containers. And so getting things on and off ships and on and off trains and on and off planes was just very, very manual and very, very fragile, if you will. And so the standardized shipping container came along in the 60s and completely revolutionized logistics, global supply chain logistics. And as a result, you could pack everything into the container. And then because the standard interface is on the container, you could pick it up off the ship, put it on the train, ship it across the country, put it on a truck, ship it to the port, all without having to open the container. And the cost of, as a percent of the cost of the goods, shipping dropped from 35% down to 3%. So it was a 10x improvement in the cost of logistics as a percent of overall product value. And in a very real sense, that analogy works for software containers as well. Moving, and Solomon framed this very well when he revealed the Docker open source project at PyCon in March 2013. And he defined it very simply, like shipping code to the server was hard back then. And it's because it's not just the code, but it's the dependencies, it's the different versions on the different layers in the stack. And the Docker container simplifies all that. And once you put all the dependencies, all the different libraries needed for an application inside that container, and build it, and now it's immutable. Shipping code, shipping apps to the server became a lot easier, and it reduced the friction of shipping code to the server. And so the analogies with the global shipping container in the physical world are actually quite apt, and we found worked very well in explaining to the world in 2013, 2014, what is this thing called a software container?
And so around the time when Docker first came about, like I think I think there was stuff before that, but I think the startup Docker like 2013, like before that the cloud came about, like AWS had this thing called AMIs where images used to be burnt in, right, and then you could restart that. There was also the concept of VMs that came out like in the VMware era, right? Like, but those are also a little bit clunkier, slower to start, not the easiest method to do when people think about software development. But this thing about containers has always been there, and you touched a little bit about like the BSD days, but even going back into the I think the what 70s, 80s in Unix, there was this thing called change root, right? Like
True. Yeah.
essentially it's not
Yeah.
containers, but like you could think about, hey, let me isolate this thing into a process separate file system. It was a primitive container of sorts, right? I think that there was jails, and I think it was
Correct.
FreeBSD, right? Like,
Correct.
and then uh, when did this, what were the troubles of like, the very early primitive containers thing? Then as it moved towards like, VMs, and then eventually moved towards more towards containers. What kind of challenges, did containers solve? And every subsequent solution that came after, like, how did it help move to kind of new ground?
Right. Well, and you described it well, June. That was a progression, and if I had to kind of point to two trends of that progression, one is um, the previous milestones in container technology development were all very infrastructure centric, right? And you referred to BSD jails, BSD Chroot, and then along came Solaris jails, right? But it was all very much geared towards infrastructure, and that kind of leads to the second point, which is we had a lot of the primitives for containerization for Linux in the Linux kernel, namespaces, C groups, right? Those are kind of the fundamental primitives around which container Linux containers are built. Um, and yet, because they're so difficult to use, only PhDs in Linux kernel engineering were able to take advantage of that. And so, again, so much credit to Solomon and the founding team. What they realized is that, okay, the primitives are there, but let's take those primitives and bring it together with developer-friendly syntax, so Git-like syntax on the command line, and let's couple that then with copy on write file system to make the image immutable and thus portable across all these different Linux environments. And so it was that combination of powerful primitives, basically abstracted away, combined with copy on write file system to make the image immutable, and then a user interface that was aligned towards developers, very familiar to developers, like such as the Git command. So Docker push, Docker pull, that was all very intentional. Is really what made, if you will, the democratization or the ease of accessibility of Linux container technology accessible to tens of millions of developers, and really what caused the Docker standard to take off in 2013.
And the shift, I think, right before containers in the form that Docker came out with, right before that there were VMs, right? Like, and you could still have a machine and you could launch a VM there, but that was kind of separate and isolated, and it had access to its own kind of virtualized CPU and virtualized memory, and then I believe that was still hard to integrate day-to-day software development with what you would see there in VMs, right?
That's right. It was big, right? It was heavy, right? And it was from an interface standpoint or user experience standpoint, it was very much geared towards ops and infrastructure, right? And so the container image only contains the application and its dependencies. It does not contain any of the OS and the OS libraries and all the subsequent kind of OS dependencies. And so it's a lot lighter weight. It's only the container, the single dependency of the container is having a Linux kernel, right? So it made containers very, very portable. And so the combination of lighter weight, more portable, and again, focused on applications, focused on developers versus infrastructure is really what enabled the ecosystem, the cloud native ecosystem that we know today.
Got it. And right around like 2013, when Solomon went and announced in, I think it was PyCon 2013, as you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst for the world of containers, and for the reason for Docker to just take off at that time? Like something was right about that point in time. Was it the cloud? Was it the whole explosion of microservice development? Was it this whole distributed architecture? If Docker had come like 10, 15 years before its time, like it probably wouldn't have been successful, generally container technology. But I think the timing was just right. But what were the kind of the critical components, and if you take that snapshot in time in the software development industry, what are the things you think that like contributed to that, like heavy popularity, especially around 2013, right?
Sure, sure. Well, then let's riff on this together because I know you were in the industry at the time, and you were at one of the foundational companies that was in this conversation. But I think there's multiple elements, right? One was we had been through by that point, by 2013, 2014, we had been through, call it 6, 7 years of cloud, right? So cloud came out in 2007, Mumble, and with the rise of AWS, and so the I'll say the leading edge of the industry was starting to get comfortable with cloud resources, um, and the industry was learning that like cloud gave you opportunities to create applications that had different properties than standard, call it standard applications or three-tiered apps. And you referenced this a little earlier, like big old VMs, right? That you just kind of plunk in the data center. That's a very different application architecture than what the cloud was enabling in terms of horizontal scaling, on demand, scale to zero, that sort of thing. So I think that was one big factor, is that the industry was realizing there is more to be taken advantage of cloud infrastructure with a potentially different approach to applications. I think adjacent to that or overlapping with that was the rise of Heroku and the ecosystem around that that was talking about 12-factor apps. And that was very much speaking to the opportunity to take more advantage of this cloud infrastructure that had been ascendant over the previous 6, 7 years. And that led to, you already referenced it, which is 12-factor apps was almost synonymous with the rise of microservices at the time. And containers didn't exist, but the thought of like, okay, we have these big application opportunities, but boy, when it's all bound up in a monolith, it's very difficult for teams to move quickly, have full ownership, and ship as frequently as they had the aspiration, and honestly their customers were demanding. And so I think all three factors together, the rise of the cloud and then the insight that we could take more advantage of it, which is intersecting or overlapping with 12-factor applications, which is relevant to the rise of microservices. And that was just very, very hot. That was a hot, you remember this, right? You were at Netflix at the time.
Yeah.
Like that was a hot conversation in the industry. I was at Puppet at the time, so I could see this happening above and around Puppet as well. And then, and yet it was still difficult to ship quickly because the unit of manufacture, if you will, for software was still anyone's anyone's decision on the best day. There's no standard unit of delivery, no standard unit of manufacture. And then along come Solomon and Docker and says, hey, the standard unit is the container. This is what we can ship from the developer laptop throughout CI/CD into production. And then we know, Kubernetes and the orchestrators came along and we talked about how we can scale that horizontally. And so that I kind of jumped to the end game, but like I think those three factors really made the conversation right, the timing right, exactly as you asked the question, framed the question, the timing right for a technology like Docker to come along and really standardize the unit of delivery, standardize the unit of manufacture for software.
Yeah, and I think like when I was in Netflix during those times, like, and I remember like we were doing stuff around computer vision, and we, used to use the OpenCV libraries, for example. Encoding teams used to use FFmpeg, and Netflix was primarily a Java shop at that point, right? Like, and then you had to
Mhm.
use these other toolings, which was written in C, C++, and when you're running a piece of code somewhere, right, in the cloud, like, you have to make sure that wherever it's running, like, it had all of these things embedded into that at runtime.
Right,
I think
right.
Netflix had its own tooling inside. I think they called it Titus, right? Like Docker. I think it came roughly around the same time, but I think in Netflix it that they continue to use Titus, but I think the need for containers was pretty obvious at that point, right? And
There was a need to standardize, right? You had all these tools, you had all this this insight that, wow, we could be taking more advantage of cloud infrastructure, but it was still very friction full to move code through the different stages of the SDLC.
Yeah, that's true. And then what was Solomon Hykes' role, like, especially around the open source momentum that Docker got, and which literally led to the early success of Docker, right? Like developers around the world started to use it. But tell me a little bit about his role and how was it like working with Solomon in the early days?
Sure. So this is well documented, but um, Solomon and Docker were originally part of a platform as a service company, PaaS, called Dot Cloud. And at the time, there was Heroku and Engine Yard and Dot Cloud, and they were all competing in the platform as a service market. Starting in the late aughts and into the tens. Um, and around 2013, um, Dot Cloud decided that okay, this PaaS business is okay, but Heroku was kind of ahead, and Dot Cloud was looking for alternative opportunities. And so the core technology of Dot Cloud, the core value proposition of Dot Cloud versus Heroku and Engineer was it could handle multiple languages, right? If you remember at the time, kind of Heroku and Dot Cloud, sorry, Heroku and Engineer were very much Ruby's on Rails
That's right.
type platforms, right? Or they were call it uniquely focused on Ruby on Rails. And Solomon and Dot Cloud were like, okay, Ruby on Rails, but also these other languages. And so that was the core value proposition, the core tech. Docker was the core tech behind Dot Cloud, and they found it so useful themselves. They said, well, what if we open sourced the core engine of Dot Cloud to the rest of the world, just as is, versus wrapping a platform as a service around it? And so that's what led to Docker. It was rewritten in Go because I think it was actually Ruby on Rails before, or Python before. So it was rewritten in Go and open source in 2013. Um, and lo and behold, it really did solve a real problem, right? Shipping code to the server is hard. It Shipping code to the server should not be language specific or tied to a specific language or tied to a specific library or tied to a specific infrastructure stack. And so that language agnosticism, if you will, is really what that plus the ease of use and the developer accessibility and things we've already talked about is really what kind of lit a spark. And to your point, in the right environment with the right conversations kind of going on at a macro level or market level at the time,
Yeah.
is what really caused it to take off. So I joined in February 2014. So it was Solomon, Ben Gold, CEO at the time, and myself to lead product, and then about 18, 19 open source engineers. And it was just very, very early. It was very exciting because we could see the downloads of the Docker engine just going through the roof, and we could see that we were really onto something. But we were still figuring out, like, okay, great that we're having all this open source adoption, but we need to create a business around this downstream. Um, we started ideating, and eventually June 2014 launched Docker Hub, so kind of a complementary service to the core Docker engine itself. And so it was a very exciting time to figure out, okay, what is the complete suite of things that we can build into this platform for developer experience, and then what is the commercial aspects of it that downstream from the open source we want to set up to monetize and grow a sustainable commercial business from there.
Yeah.
Um, so very exciting days.
For sure. And then you mentioned about dot cloud, and was the pivot obvious at that time? Like, and what do you think like Solomon got absolutely right that others missed?
Well, so this was slightly before my time because I joined in February 2014. But as I got to know the company and speaking with Solomon and Ben, um, it was pretty apparent that once Docker was open sourced in March 2013, the downloads and the takeoff was very apparent to the rest of the company. So much so that they changed the name within 6 months. They changed the name in the autumn of 2013 from Cloud to Docker, and set about selling off the PaaS business. And on top of that momentum, raised a Series A from Greylock in January 2014. So the takeoff of the open source project, that it was really solving a very critical problem, was pretty apparent to them, as to the rest of the market that was watching all this. And that's how I discovered it. I was still at Puppet, and I had a handful of accounts that were my canary accounts, meaning early adopters that I kind of stayed close to. And within 3 months of Docker's open source in March 2013, Docker started showing up in these Puppet Canary accounts. And I was like, "Ooh, what's that about?" And so I got my hands on it and started digging. It's like, "Ooh, this is gonna change things." Because Puppet at the time was kind of very adjacent and trying to solve the problem, but from a very different perspective. Puppet was kind of outside in, trying to use automation of configuration management to standardize environments across servers, between development and production, between development staging production. And Docker just made that 20 times easier, right? Like just the effort you needed to do to create standardized environments using Docker versus the Puppet, and learn Puppet language and set up the Puppet server, all that. Like it was night and day in terms of friction.
Yeah.
Um, and so maybe coming back to your second question, like I think Solomon and the core team just nailed the developer experience. They nailed the portability of applications across any Linux environment, and they nailed creating enough surface area for ecosystem partners to join in the uptick or the upswell or the creation of this market, because it really created a market, right? It created the cloud native market. And what I mean by that latter point is there are places for the storage providers to play. There are places for the networking providers to play. There's places for observability providers to play. And so around this core runtime, there's plenty of opportunities for the ecosystem to hook in. And when you have ecosystem kind of hooked in, it kind of creates this market and pulls the whole industry forward. And of course, Docker was right in the middle of that.
Yeah, and then while just the format of the Docker file itself early on, right? Like it enabled doing basic shell scripts, so you could use tools like apt-get or yum to pull in all the dependencies. You could do all kinds of stuff with like basic shell commands. So it also just opened up and made it also highly customizable, right? Like
Yeah, right.
uh, and what and I think that also led to the popularity there, right? Because not only was this kind of easy to use, but you could customize it in a way that you wanted to, right? And that power to
Right.
the developers, I think, also made it really popular. But others, you talked a little bit about like downloads going up, and talk a little bit about Puppet and stuff. Like were there other signals that, I know this was kind of really early signs of product market fit, right? Like were there any other specific signals, metrics? I don't know if Docker was on GitHub at that point in time, or
Yeah, it was on Git. I mean, it was an open source project, so it was all being done in the open. It was development or building in the open on GitHub. And so you could see the GitHub participants and contributors jumping in. You could see the stars going up. Um, you could see just the word of mouth. Like the team was tiny. There was very little there. I think we had one one marketer at the time, digital marketer, and he was fantastic at creating kind of technical demos and examples, but the word of mouth is just off the charts. And the product had built in, of course, a certain virality, meaning once a developer built a container and pushed it to Docker Hub, they could send a link to a buddy and say, "Hey, check this thing out. I just pushed this server or this application to Docker Hub," and of course, their friend to take advantage of that had to download the Docker engine in order to pull that image and run it, right? And so, in that sense, the product had a virality built into it that was just very natural for developers.
And then there was also adoption by some big companies back then, right? I think Spotify, eBay, if I can remember correctly, right? Like, but other big companies that came into play and also started contributing back in open source? Because I remember, like, when we were doing Conductor at Netflix, companies like Tesla, GitHub, like, Swiggy, there's a ton of these companies, JP Morgan, they all started to come in and contribute. And you know, at that time, we never thought about, like, starting a company about this later on. But those are all great signals saying that, hey, people are seeing advantage, like, the value in this. Developers are seeing value in this. There were things that were not working that great, but people still wanted to use it and they wanted more of it, right? Requests for features would come in. There would be organic pull requesting, requesting coming in. But were there other, like, how was the early adoption from enterprise companies?
Yeah, well, so as you know, right, as you live through, like the tech sector is always the early adopter, or the early adopters. Most early adopters come from the tech sector, and so those same tech sector companies that were in the microservices conversation, they were the first ones to kind of jump on Docker. And you've already referenced them, and Netflix was in there, and so um, if a company was part of microservices discussion at the time, 2013, 2014, it seemed very natural for them to lean in and try Docker and start then contributing back to the project. In addition, there's plenty of ecosystem partners around that were also very aware of the microservices conversation and trying to contribute, and so they jumped on as well. And so, Red Hat jumped on early and contributed to the project. Microsoft jumped on early and contributed to the project. Even IBM came along in 2014, 2015, and wanted to take containers to their mainframe business. Right. So there was both a lot of validation from the early adopters in the market, early adopter end customers, and then of course kind of vendors and partners in the ecosystem also contributing and jumping on.
And as the users start to become popular, right, you also, to kind of enhance and improve the product, you also need to understand the ideal customer profile, right? So was it what was it? Was it devs? Like, was it startups, large companies? Was it mostly on DevOps side? And then talk to me a little bit about, like, the whole dev centric culture of, like, Docker adoption.
Yeah. So as you know, as markets mature, the ICP evolves as well, right? But in the early days, it was very much tech sector companies and then the development organization within those tech sector companies. Um, Now, as the market matured and we're getting into the late teens here, 2015, 2016, 2017, so the second half of the teens, I guess, um, it became clear that what we now call platform engineering teams, back in the day, DevOps teams, could see the value in creating a containerization platform for their internal developers and and of course production, right? And so it became because containers became the unit of shipping code, it became very natural for the DevOps teams to adopt containerization platforms and have a set of services and support for their developers that then led right through the SDLC into what became kind of Kubernetes production deployments on the back end. And so the ICP evolved over time, started with developers, grew eventually into DevOps, um, and it became really important, I think, for the entire industry to realize the balance between both of those as the market matured, that you had to continue to make it easy to use and approachable for developers while making it robust for DevOps on all the kind of classic enterprise ilities, right? So security, reliability, scalability, auditability, manageability, and so as we developed the feature set over those years, we had to add on to the very developer centric features that the company started with.
And did you have any data on, like, how the early people, early set of adopters were using this, where they were using this? Anything that surprised you? For example, percentage of people using it in a local development environment on your laptops or your desktops to move, and from there and moving to production in the cloud. Like, do you have some early data insights on that?
Yeah, so the pattern in the early days was kind of classic, server-side applications or three-tier applications, right? So your lamp stack was a classic early example, and we had a very exciting partnership with Microsoft on the .NET side that was a two-tier application for kind of .NET, ASP.NET applications. So that was kind of the classic starting point. Um, and yes, I mean the natural workflow was from development into CI, into deployment, into production. But because it's open source and because developers are incredibly creative, we never ceased being surprised by the creative ways in which developers would take the technology and go places that we didn't envision. So, as an example, with the rise of IoT and putting applications on the edge, we saw requests for Docker to show up in set-top boxes, consumer set-top boxes, requests for Docker to get this manage elevators that are going, the elevator automation going up and down commercial and residential buildings, to manage manufacturing tools on the manufacturing line, like, and things that devices and end user use cases that 2013, 2014 hadn't even imagined, right? But it shows you again the creativity of developers, and when you make something that really hits this again, this need of lowering friction of delivering value, right? Lowering friction of shipping apps. And as apps start to live in more places than just the data center and the cloud, then Docker became a very natural piece of that application delivery infrastructure. If it was a refrigerator, mobile phone, we have Docker installed on military aircraft. Like it's everywhere because it just again lowers this friction of delivering application value, and that makes the ability to frequently update that value just so much easier.
Yeah. I think we saw a similar thing in, the open source conductor when we looked at like users like, nuclear reactors, like, IoT devices,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
you just never know where people are going to be. And I think like recently we also discovered one more thing, like, college applications for, UC colleges, right? Like, the whole system is
yeah,
built on conductor. Like,
yeah,
you'd never have thought like, early days, like, that this would explode like the way that.
yeah. And it's it's creative, it's fun, and frankly, it's humbling, right? When you see just the range of applications and use cases, and a real privilege to be part of that, really transforming the way in which software is developed for any application deployed anywhere. I'll give you one more example of what we just were completely surprised by. So it's a little bit of story, but I'll keep it brief. As we all know, there's asteroids in their own belt zooming around the solar system, and every once in a while, there's rings of asteroids, and some of the asteroids kind of come close to Earth. And it turns out there's this whole NASA group that's responsible for basically doing scenarios and simulation of like, okay, what happens if one of these asteroids comes too close, and figuring out what the remediations will be. Well, we discovered that this NASA group was actually using Docker to simulate and create test environments of one of their remediations, which was fly a missile into the asteroid and knock it off course from Earth. And if this sounds familiar, there's a movie about this called Armageddon, starring no other than Bruce Willis. And so, we dote tongue in cheek, but there's some truth to it, which is, not only does Docker help you with your servers, but Docker is helping save the world from asteroid impact. So just a fun story, and there's lots of things like that just surprised us and delighted us and humbled us as the market evolved and matured.
I think that's the power of really like open source software, giving it to the hands of the developer,
100%.
and then making it like, customizable and a platform solution where people can build like wonderful magical things on the top of that, right?
100%. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So moving forward, right? Like, tell us a little bit about like those Docker Swarm, those Docker Enterprise, Kubernetes came around the same time. I don't remember the exact timelines on what happened when, but was this in response to Kubernetes or Kubernetes was in response to this? Like, tell us a little bit about the Swarm versus the Kubernetes story and the whole Docker
Sure.
Enterprise in general.
Sure. So, a little more than a year in, so kind of 2014, we could see that just the number of containers being created needed some layer on top in order to orchestrate. Because they were being created not just on a single node, but for any sort of 24/7 app that needs failover, right? You need multiple nodes, or whether it's for failover or for performance or both. And so the single Docker engine was very much a single node technology. Um, and so the industry, again, a year into the democratization, if you will, of containers. So, from March 2013, was already buzzing about like, okay, how do we think about managing this at scale? And so Kubernetes actually was announced at the very first DockerCon. It was announced um, in June 2014. And Eric Brewer from Google, right? He was head of the Kubernetes team at the time, announced Kubernetes on stage at DockerCon, and we simultaneously announced on stage a Docker Swarm. So they were actually announced at the same time, geared towards solving similar challenges, just from a very, very different. They came at it from a very, very different angle. Kubernetes, as it's well known and history is written, came out of Google's deep experience with managing tens of thousands of servers per data center across multiple data centers using what's called the Borg technology. And so thus it's very, very kind of at scale, very horizontal, very much a systems or an ops, comes at it from a very systems ops centric point of view. Swarm comes at it from a very much a developer centric point of view, and thus the primitives and the way in which the mental model evolved was very much how a developer thinks about deploying an application. So they were solving a similar problem just from very different viewpoints. Um, and there lies the beauty of competition. So as the layer above the container runtime, Kubernetes and Swarm, and what we saw happen, and a lot of credit to the Kubernetes team, is they created a number of interfaces for their community to plug in. So interfaces for authentication and for storage and for networking. Um, and they also did a fantastic job of encapsulating kind of the concerns of operators. And the kube YAML file is the famous kind of center point for this conversation, right? Which has over 330 knobs, bells, and whistles. And Swarm did not have that. Swarm was a simpler product geared towards developers' needs. And I would say that combined with, frankly, Google's brand at running things at scale and managing complex infrastructure at scale, um, really helped that ecosystem take off. So much so that in 2017 we said, you know what, we at Docker said, you know what, let's support Kubernetes as well. And so we embedded not only Swarm but embedded Kubernetes into the Docker Enterprise product, so that our communities, which was now clearly not just developers but developers and DevOps, that the DevOps engineers could choose kind of which orchestrator to use in deploying applications to production. And
And
so to this day, yeah, sorry, I'll wrap with like to this day, um, Kubernetes obviously is the market leader. And we have Kubernetes in Docker desktop today, right? So developers can have a production-like experience locally. But then Swarm continues to be an upstream open source project that continues to be supported, and there's a subset of the market that continues to use that and deploy it at scale.
then going back to the Kubernetes really took off at that time, right? Like, and then probably the Google backing us also something to do with that. But any learnings from that period, like, if you had to go back and do Swarm all over again, like, would you do it any differently?
I mean, armchair quarterbacks is easy, right? And looking through the lens of gosh, more than 10 years, or almost 10 years at this time, um, I think it's really important to ensure that all the different players in the ecosystem have a role and have a clear role to play. And I think Kubernetes did a wonderful job of that with their special interest groups, with the interfaces that they created for those SIGs, and much like Docker was carried forward in the early days by the ecosystem, creating that allowed the ecosystem around orchestration around Kubernetes to carry it forward as well. And so there was more we probably could have done at Docker around that as well. Second is the developer persona is obviously critical in this layer in the stack, and will continue to be. Um, was there more there that we could have done for the DevOps or Ops personas? I think the answer there is probably yes as well.
And then this is probably counterintuitive, but you mentioned about this hundreds of knobs available in Kubernetes, right? Sometimes also like making it like super hard to use, but also gives the flexibility to do a lot of stuff. And I think around the time there were every single day there would be a startup that would spawn up, like was doing something around Kubernetes, right? Like and
Right,
then and
right.
then I don't know if it was the difficulty of getting your head through Kubernetes had something to do with that, but it definitely also had product market fit, and just took off. And I think like pretty much every cloud provider also today provides native kind of solutions around those, right?
Correct. Correct.
There was also Containerd that was originally part of
Hmm.
Docker, right? And
Hmm.
I think it was spun out into another open source project and went under Linux Foundation or CNCF or one of that. Like, what led to
That's
that
right.
decision? Like, why was it spun out? Like,
That's right. So very much. So the industry is standing way back, right? So industry, meaning both vendors as well as customers, want to continue to get the benefit of containerization, the benefit of Dockerization, without feeling that they're going to get locked into a particular vendor or a particular infrastructure, right? And so Kubernetes, that was one of Kubernetes benefits as well. Even though it was created at Google, it was given to the CNCF and thus had a vendor neutral governance structure around it. Um, Docker, while it was Apache v2, Docker Engine was Apache v2, was still under the governance of Docker. And so our solve for that was to spin out Containerd, which was the core runtime engine. And it's actually the piece that Kubernetes deploys to, right? Um, and to this day, the Docker engine is built around the Containerd subsystem, but that subsystem was given to the Linux Foundation, a peer group to CNCF called the Open Container Initiative, OCI. And so what that allowed was like, okay, now the industry kind of took a breath and said, okay, great. So now we have Kubernetes and Containerd. Kubernetes deploys to Containerd. Docker Engine is downstream from Containerd and embeds it as part of the Docker Engine runtime, all of which is Apache v2. And then Docker Desktop is further downstream from that, which then packages it all up into a developer-facing desktop product for Mac and for Windows and even for Linux. And so, long-winded answer, but it was an answer to like, okay, a Docker engine right now is under the governance of Docker Inc. Let's make sure the core engine is under a neutral governance so that the industry continues to support that standard runtimes, that standard protocol, that standard image format. Because what we didn't want, staying even further back, and you and I have been around, we know we've seen this movie before. What we didn't want is the industry to balkanize or fragment. Right, we saw this happen with the Unix industry back in the day, right? So nothing that written to Solaris would run on AIX would run on HPUX or anything else, right? And then, unfortunately, the Linux market had the same balkanization or fragmentation, right? So nothing that's written for Red Hat will run on Ubuntu. Canonical will run on SUSE.
yep.
And so we said, okay, third time's the charm. Like we have an opportunity in the container industry to have a homogeneous standard and runtime and wire protocol and image format such that we don't have this fragmentation that would certainly frustrate users and then create a lot of mess for vendors to have to support multiple different stacks and fragments. And so by standardizing and putting Kubernetes under open governance, and then by standardizing Containerd and all the formats around the image and the wire protocol and the runtime, that allowed this industry to this day, by the way, remain homogeneous such that the same container image that's written on Docker Desktop can run on Red Hat OpenShift, can run on Amazon AWS, EKS, can run on Azure AKS, right? All unchanged. And you can't say that about the previous generations of application tech stacks.
And making that shift happen, right? Containerd going off, spinning off its own project. Did you see kind of the hockey stick growth, GitHub stars and all of the open source metrics that you see with Containerd, just like you saw with Docker?
Yeah, it's a super popular project. I mean, they kind of go together, right? Because Docker, again, is dependent on Containerd. Um, And so you've got Containerd, I think it's important to be clear though. Containerd is a subcomponent, meaning by itself, it's not necessarily developer facing, right? It's an API driven engine that is driven by Kubernetes or any other orchestrator for that matter. But it's used by all the major cloud providers, right, as their container engine, whether they're deploying to Kubernetes or something else. And then, like I said, for developer facing products like Docker Desktop, it's also the engine in Docker Desktop as well. So it's an embedded component, and so we saw a lot of uptake from vendors in the ecosystem wanting to have a standardized component to deploy and run container images to.
And right around that time, like, Docker Enterprise was also sold off to Mirantis. Like, what was the business reason behind it? Like, and also at that point in time, like, what were the different revenue streams that you had in the company, right? Like, were the support models, there were large companies already using it. There's Docker Enterprise. Like, talk to us a little bit about, like, revenue streams coming in. Where did the revenue come in? Why did you decide to sell it off to Mirantis?
Yeah, so this is 2019, right? So in 2019, we stood back and looked at the business, and the not just the primary, but the only source of revenue, 99% of the revenue, was from Docker Enterprise. And it was an okay business too, but we stood back and said, are we really getting the full potential of Docker, the brand, the technology, the developer love? Because the developer love was there, but it was not, we did not wrap a business around it. We continued to kind of open source. We had Hub and we had, free Docker desktop at the time. And so the decision really came down to, if we sell off the enterprise, what we call the enterprise business, and it was really kind of an ops centric product. If we sell off Docker Enterprise and all the pieces around that, the customers, the tech, unfortunately, some of the team members, would we be able to stand back and restart the business and develop, not just more on the developer side, but develop a commercial business around that? Because we had kind of a split brain. We had a lot of developer love and excitement, but the monetization was happening over here with ops and infrastructure, and it made for just a very difficult company to operate and scale. And so that was the driver of the decision, was to, like, let's just focus on developers, and to do so, we need to unfortunately kind of carve out this business and hand it off to someone else.
Got it. Then, Docker as a company, was it making money, a lot of money from Docker Enterprise at that point? Because eventually, Mirantis, did make a good amount of revenue, right? Like, so in hindsight, like, there could have been also, separate teams being spun out, yes. But I think it looks like you want to keep the focus on developer adoption at that point more than anything else.
That's correct. And we wanted to focus on developers because that's where the brand was strong, and that's where the bottoms up adoption was strong. And so we envisioned we could also make a very, very efficient go to market, which we did. Um, but also, Mirantis did a fantastic job with the Ops Center product, also because Mirantis had a great, foundation on which to do so. Meaning, if you recall what they had at the time, they started as an OpenStack services provider, and they evolved into an OpenStack product company. And so they had, this install base of ops relationships built on OpenStack, that they were then able to come in and sell Docker Enterprise on top of. And to your point, and to their credit, they did a fantastic, fantastic job with that.
And at that point in time, this was a big reset in Docker, right? Like, and there was a big
Yeah, it was.
refocus on the developers. Had the ICP changed from the early days in Docker? And when at that point in time, when the reset was happening, like, what was the direction that you set in the company? Like, what kind of developers to focus on? Talk to us a little bit about, like, there's a big strategy shift. Like, how did you get the company together?
Yeah, so it was a big shift because, at the time of, we called it the split internally, but, basically the divestiture of the Docker Enterprise business. That business, the ICP and the value proposition was all very ops centric. So Docker Enterprise was sold to DevOps and Ops. It was sold to, heads of infrastructure. It was honestly sold to big companies. Um, and we pivoted almost 180 degrees to, a small developer team. ICP was developers and his or her manager, tools for just the inner loop of development and some of the outer loop. And so while the core tech remained consistent, meaning the core open source tech, Docker Hub, Docker Desktop, the way in which we packaged and priced and built a business around the tech was completely different from the previous Docker Enterprise business that we split off in 2019. And so it did require kind of a complete rewiring of the company in terms of, like, okay, who's the customer? What's their needs? What's their pain? How can we address that pain? How are we doing that? How are we addressing that pain better than anyone else in the market? Okay, given that, developers, want to try things for free with no economic friction, great. Okay, on top of that, how do you then build a commercial business that's downstream from that? All of that had to be rethought. So we were fortunate that we had the brand, we had the developer love, we had some fantastic teammates that stuck around, that stayed with us, that we didn't unfortunately have to sell off with the rest of the business. And so we had good core assets with which to start, but we had to redo the entire company from the top to bottom.
did the ICP of the developer, the kind of developer used it, did that change from like back in the 2013 days? Anything that you had to fundamentally change? Because early on it's also developer led. Like now you're going double downing on that, like because in between there was a whole Docker enterprise. Like, but when you made that shift, what changed in those 5 6 years, right? Like from a developer,
Sure.
how developers use and created the applications and all of those, right?
Sure, and it's a fair question. It's an insightful one because in 2013, 2014, you're dealing with the early edge, the early adopters in the market, right? And so, command line focused Linux developers, right? Very, very much hardcore. And by 2019, the market had expanded so quickly, and Docker was kind of known so well beyond just the early adopter markets that we had to make it much more addressable and accessible to a wider range of developers. And so that meant some of the sharp edges of Docker Desktop smoothed off. It meant more GUI support for some categories or cohorts of developers. It meant more documentation to help folks get started in kind of the on ramps and the kind of use cases for Docker as a developer tool. And so a lot went into just um, lowering the barriers of adoption and just making it much easier to use on a day-to-day basis for again a market that was 6 years on and had attracted not just millions of developers but tens of millions of developers by that point in time.
And during this, reboot or split as you called it, right? Like, was there a morale challenge in the company? How do you keep the teams motivated? Like, and then from an operations perspective and a cultural reset and a community trust perspective, right? Like, what are the things that changed in the company and just how you operated the company? Like, did you change values within the company, the hiring philosophy, like in the focus areas, like and that's there's all these technical things and what to focus on, but also keeping the employees in the company motivated and figuring out like what kind of people to kind of bring into the company and what kind of culture reset is needed, right? Like it's a very very difficult thing to do, right? Like, but talk to us a little bit about like how did you navigate that? What are some insights that you like? Share us some insights that from those times.
Sure. And it's a deep question, and we could talk a lot about this, and layered on top of the very disruptive change of a divestiture and a recapitalization, layer on COVID, which came 3 months after the pivot of the company, right? So a lot of external pressures on the company and employees, and I give the team so much credit for powering through that. But to your question, yeah, we reset the values of the company. We stood back and talked with the employees because a lot of pain when you go through a divestiture and you wipe out everyone's stock and you reset. Um, and we talked about what values we wanted to embrace. We changed the name from values to virtues. We made it really clear that we were going to focus on developers, and so instead of customer obsession, which was the first draft of that virtue, we tightened it to developer obsession, right? Just made it really clear that this is going to be the North Star of the business. And then to another part of your question, there were some employees who just were frankly disappointed. Recall that in 2019, at the time, Docker had raised several rounds of financing and was looking like a later stage mature company at a valuation that reflected that. And so many of the employees had joined in the prior year or two expected the company to be either purchased or go public. And when you recap, and all of a sudden it's a Series A company with very, very different risk reward profile, that can be unsettling to a lot of employees. And some opted out, and no judgment at all. Like they thought they were joining a Series C, Series D company. All of a sudden they find themselves in a Series A company. That can be really frustrating. And so what we did just from a day-to-day basis is we were hyper transparent with the financials. We were hyper transparent with the progress of the business, with the new roadmap that we were developing, and just made it clear that like this is where we're going. We think it's exciting. We think developers are a fantastic opportunity to build a business around. And if you're with us, fantastic. God bless. And if you're not, no harm, no foul. And if you want to leave, thank you for your service and best of luck in your next endeavors. But it was a tough first year, Jude. It was
Yeah.
a very tough first year.
And you talked about North Star metrics, right? Like, and you talked a little bit about it was customer obsession before, and now it was more like the developer experience. So, from a specific North Star metric, what was it before and after the reset?
Well, so before, because we were focused on ops and big enterprise customers, it was very much focused on kind of enterprise customer deployments, and the financials around that. You can look at ARR and net dollar retention and things like that. With the pivot and refocusing on developers, we started just earlier upstream with active users, right? So DAO Mao Wow, or DAO Wow Mao, so daily active, weekly active, monthly active, became a very focused area of ours. And then you can pull those apart further, right, and see what your onboarding rates are and your retention rates are. And then of course downstream from that, you of course have to account for and attract and drive ARR and drive net dollar retention. But we knew that if we didn't get developer love right on the front end of that, then the downstream metrics wouldn't show up positively either. So and Amazon does a nice job of talking about input metrics and output metrics. And so we shifted the company to focus more on input metrics to make sure we were making developers happy, that they were being productive, that they were delighted to use the product, believing strongly that we understood our model such that we got that right, then the output metrics of ARR and net dollar retention would follow.
And then what about the relationship with with the open source community? There was the whole Docker desktop that you eventually wanted to monetize, right? But with developer adoption, you want to focus a lot more on open source developer facing features. What were your kind of some of your principles on things that you put into the product? Like, what goes back into open source, and then what stays in enterprise, right? Like that doesn't go back into open source.
Right, right. So we spent a lot of time talking about this internally, and to this day, it continues to be a very, very rich topic of conversation. But to simplify it, we drew broad lines like this as a starting point. Let me emphasize, this was not like holy writ, right? But it was like, okay, let's assume this framework, but before we make any decisions, let's go validate this, and if we have to move the line, we'll do so. And so the framework became anything, any feature or capability that was directly developer facing that the vast majority cared about, that would continue to be open source. And this was the Docker CLI, the Docker engine runtime, the Docker image format, right? And we can go through all those things that a developer touches and addresses day to day, and works on day to day. And then for the second category was there's a set of capabilities and features that large companies need in order to adopt technologies that we found most developers don't care about or care very little about. And this was things like single sign-on, SSO, role-based access control, control plane technologies for auditability and manageability of thousands of desktops at scale. Like there's a lot of capabilities in that bucket that most developers, because it doesn't impact their day to day and it's not developer facing features and functionality, that they don't care about. And so as a starting point, we're like, hey, is this a developer facing feature capability? Yes, no. Um, if not, then we think it stays closed source. Okay, let's go check that before we kind of pull the trigger. That was in general the algorithm, Jew, but again, we didn't use it blindly. We vetted this and just used that as a starting point for those conversations.
And then building up the engineering org also from that point, right? Like the kind of people that you hired, I'm sure there was some changes that were probably made. Say, hey, here is the profile of the people that we need to hire from now on, given the big shift in how Docker is going to evolve. Primarily on focusing on developer experience, right? Like, and also community re-engagement, developer relations. What was the big shift, up until that point, and how kind of, because getting the right kind of people into the company at the right time is also important. But what are some of the big things that changed there, and that eventually you thought worked really, was a really good decision at that point in time?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of them, one of you hinted at already, which is they had to be excited about developers, right? They had to be excited about solving problems for developers or improving the developer experience. That they could see that containers were just becoming a part of the fabric of the end-to-end SDLC, and in doing so, that gave us a rich opportunity to build additional capabilities in and around that environment. So that was kind of point one. Point two, which we haven't talked about yet, but with the onslaught of COVID, we were a 60-40 hybrid company, meaning 60% in the office, 40% out of the office before COVID. When COVID hit, of course, everyone went home. And if you all recall 2020, we didn't know how long COVID was going to last. And we were then at that point, by that point, we were an early stage Series A startup with not a lot of cash in the bank. So we sold off all our offices. So we kind of burnt the boats and went all in on the remote first. And so that became a second really important hiring criteria was that are you excited by and value the flexibility and can work well and effectively with colleagues in a remote first environment? So those were two, and then of course, more details from there, Jew, but like with like, are you excited about solving problems for developers and delighting developers? It wasn't just developer satisfaction, but with like delighting developers. And two is, are you excited by and can work effectively in a remote first environment?
And at that time, obviously, remote was the only way to go, given the state of things during COVID. Uh, early days, I remember during the COVID times, right? People just had nothing to do. There was lockdown, and as developers, you would see like every metric in the company going up. There were more check-ins, there were more PRs, there was more code getting stuff shipped. The stuff was getting shipped faster. And then you move forward, a few months later, restrictions kind of slowly went down, and people had more things to do, and then productivity slowly started to dip again, right? And now you see a lot of companies trying to get people back into the office. What were some of the things that you saw in Docker? Similar trends. Like talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, we actually saw a really interesting thing, two, one of which won't be surprising, or maybe neither is surprising, but one is the 60/40 model before COVID, before we went all in on remote first. Um, didn't really make everyone happy. And in fact, the 40% really were unhappy because they were not getting the water cooler talk. They weren't getting the subtleties of leaning over the shoulder of their colleagues. And so they always felt like second class citizens, right? Because they were zooming in when you had a whiteboard and everyone else jumping around and having you know, seemingly a very engaged conversation. They always felt like they were looking in from the outside. So when we went to remote first for everyone, even the playing field, we actually saw satisfaction go up across the board because like everyone's on the same playing field, and that led to better meeting hygiene. That led to notes being taken, agendas being sent out. Everyone was from the same playing field, so you didn't have this different class of employees. Everyone was a single class, so everyone was happier actually. Second thing is, which you could have seen kind of forward looking, but in the hurly burly of COVID, we didn't fully appreciate is we were able to hire fantastic talent from anywhere, from around the world. And we had folks who had been using Docker forever that they just loved the product. And it was like their dream to work at a company with a product that they loved, but they were nowhere near San Francisco Bay Area, or they were nowhere near our European hubs, such they never even bothered to apply. But now that we were hiring remote, they applied and we found this fantastic talent. And then third, again, probably no surprise, is employees' ability to manage their work-life balance, to take their kids to school, but then come back and log in and knock out that pull request or have a huddle with their colleagues. Like that flexibility really improve employee sat. So we actually found the remote first really worked really well for us. Now as backdrop, maybe one more comment just to set context. Docker had hired a lot of its early team members and continued to hire, particularly on the technical side, out of the open source community. And as you know, Jew, from open source, like open source is kind of distributed first anyway, because you have people who are interested in a project contributing to that project from around the world. So that DNA of operating in a remote model, was kind of built in, particularly to the engineering team from the get-go. So going all in remote first wasn't as big a leap from, say, a company that didn't come from open source roots and didn't have as many open source contributors in the company itself.
And during that phase, like getting a lot of remote developers, like and from all parts of the world. Uh, did it affect the kind of roadmap, the kind of contributions that were coming in? Was that on a positive or on a negative side? Because culture, is also sometimes local, right? Like, and if you look at Bay Area developers, they're all talking to each other. They are at conferences, and they're living and breathing the same thing. And then you go to another part of the world, people just think differently. Did that change the way the whole open source kind of roadmap was molded after that?
I don't think so because from the beginning, even before the split in 2019, we had, like I said before, we had a 60/40 split, right? So we had representation of engineers in Europe, right? In France, in the UK, in Asia, as well as North America, including the Bay Area. So so when we went all in on developers in 2019, and then in 2020 when we went remote first, we didn't see that disrupt that much disruption in call it the type or the taste of the features and the velocity of the features from the different developer communities we had in the company.
Got it. And then at that point in time, like there was this big focus on, developer experience, developer adoption. But at some point, like you also needed to know that, hey, how would you eventually monetize that? Like, Docker desktop was one thing that came out of that. What were the other things that came? Like, obviously, think about containers, it is, running pieces of code. You think about like, running containers like cloud compute versus that, Docker desktop, like what were the options on the table? And then eventually why was Docker desktop as one of the big things that you want to monetize?
Right. So it's all of what I'm going to share next stays true to the North Star of developer obsession, right? So that virtue stayed true. And what we realized was that we could expand the surface area that we provided to developers beyond just the command line, beyond just Docker Engine and Docker Desktop. And so the products that we provided over the years, um, were additional developer facing products that were adjacent to the desktop functionality. So what's an example of that? So we launched a product, obviously Docker Hub already existed, right? So you had a marketplace for containerized applications that complemented the desktop experience. And so that was existed, and there's ways in which we could monetize the call it the most aggressive consumers of that. We put in at some point, not at some point, we put in at the tail end of 2020 rate limits, because we had some users who were hammering Hub, million pulls a day, right? And it's like, okay, wait a minute, like that's not a developer motion right there. That's some bot that's hammering or some CI that's hammering Hub. Um, but we left but that monetization of like less than 0.1% of Hub traffic subsidized the rest of Hub for everyone else, right? So continue to remain free for the individual developer or the small developer team. But that's an example of a complementary service, the Docker Hub service that complemented desktop. But over the years, then you saw, for example, helping developers make sure that they're building container images with libraries and layers that were not compromised with security vulnerabilities. And so that led to what's called Docker Scout, which enabled developers to understand, okay, is this library susceptible an exploit, to an attack? And we put that right in the plugins to Visual Studio Code. So it was right in the command line. Even before the image was built, they could inspect the package and understand if it presented a vulnerability. We launched a product called Docker Build Cloud, which for developers that were using underpowered laptops, allowed them to accelerate the builds in the cloud. And if they were in part of a team environment, to cache the layers in the cloud such that the team benefited from using a cloud-based building environment. And to your observation, we also monetize desktop. And so the observation there was that there were large organizations that were getting a lot of benefit from desktop, building applications that were running their businesses, that would be very willing to pay a reasonable price for that local desktop experience. And so we set a threshold like, hey, if you're above this number of employees and this much revenue, and you're using Docker Desktop to build applications that are running your business, meaning like demos, fine, sales presentations, fine, education training, fine. But if you're using it to build apps that are in production running your business, then you need to pay. And so that was really geared towards um, not changing the user persona. The user persona was still the developer, but it was the managers and there's managers who were sponsoring Docker desktop use across the organization, that we asked for budget to basically continue funding the investment in features and capabilities to make the product more and more, call it enterprise ready and enterprise serviceable at scale.
And around that time also there was licensing changes that happened to desktop, right? Like what was the kind of licensing before that, after that? Like was there a lot of backlash? How was that managed? I don't think the backlash lasted long, but at that point in time, there wasn't. I think the popularity still soared, which was evidence that developers still loved this, right? But talk to us a little bit about like how do you think about licensing changes, and also I believe this was a per seat model licensing. Like what are the options on the table again at that point in time, and how do you navigate that phase?
Yeah, yeah. So um, what many don't know is that while Docker Desktop embeds many open source components, Docker Desktop itself as an overall product never was open source. It was always a commercial product. Now, it was always a commercial product available for free.
Yeah.
And so getting to your question, the change in license wasn't a change from open source to commercial. It was commercial, and it was a change from free for everyone to free for a subset of the market and above those thresholds that I mentioned earlier, above a certain revenue limit and above a certain employee limit. If you were using Docker Desktop to create commercial applications, then you had to pay on a per seat basis. And so, yeah, to your point, whenever there's a change in free to pay for, so free for everyone to free for many, but not for everyone, um, I should say it's still free for most. I should say that really clearly. Like, still, most of Docker Desktop usage today, like 80, 90 some percent of Docker Desktop usage is for free. Okay. Um, but that 10, 20%, if you're inside the organization, you're like, oh, wait a minute, now I have to pay for this. And we were very, very cognizant of that. And so we priced it very economically so that it would be like a couple lattes a month sort of thing. It's like a latte a month. And so most managers looking at the price are like, boy, I get so much productivity, I get so much velocity from my developers using Docker desktop locally. Is it worth a cup of coffee a month? Like, absolutely. So there was pushback, and I'd say the noise lasted for a month-ish, plus minus. But within a couple months, things had calmed down. The managers were always calm about it. It was more kind of the developers who felt like there had been a bait and switch. Um, that were frustrated. But look, we went out of our way to explain like this allows us to invest in the product. It allows us to invest in the open source. And on a regular basis, at least a quarterly basis, we would be doing community all hands and stand-ups to show that this monetization of desktop was leading to more developer value at a faster clip. We were able to hire more engineers um, and really increase the feature velocity, not just for commercial features, but for open source and free features as well.
And then how big is the addressable market for the Docker user base? Because I think like GitHub probably is that one product that pretty much captures every single developer out there, right? I'm sure there's people, and especially with the popularity of open source. I think back in the day they also announced, I think it was probably around the 2020-ish time, like hey, they hit 100 million users on GitHub. Recent GitHub universe, they also put the goal towards going towards 1 billion developers. But that's developers that ever have written any piece of code. It could be starting from early elementary school kids to non-professional developers. But your Docker user base itself, right? What is that addressable market, and how much of that was already captured when the split happened, and then how much of that is captured at this point in time?
Yeah, yeah. So lots of questions in there. So, um, uh, the overall developer market, as you said, let's call it kind of back-end developers, right? Because that's Docker's traditional use case, although it is used by many other developer cohorts. The classic kind of back-end developer, and you already kind of qualified out some of the other code that's being committed on GitHub, is on the order of 30 some million developers worldwide. And that is growing very, very aggressively, like 7 to 9% year over year. It's one of the fastest growing careers, and with AIs, which I know we're going to talk about, it's growing even faster now. But that was going to grow to 45 million developers by the end of the decade, right? So that's the ramp, pretty good ramp, right? From 30 some million to 45 million. Docker, when we did the split, it was right around 10 million or so developers, and I know recently this year we crossed over 26 million registered developers with us, and so we captured a good chunk of that, call it back end server side developer market, which again is a subset of what we believe the overall developer opportunity is.
And then when you're getting, capture a significant piece of that, addressable market, obviously you want to get them to, use more and more, right? And then, so in the pipeline, like, what were the big things saying, hey, are there new product lines that you're thinking about? Are there new features saying, hey, yes, we captured a huge amount, of that developer market already, but, let's add more value added stuff that they can, developers can get more value out of that, right? Like,
Right.
uh, first piece, I think you already captured, like, what are the new things that were on the horizon when in the last few years, for example? Right?
Right. So we've already talked about kind of additional stages of the SDLC, right? So additional services around the inner loop as well as the outer loop. And we talked about Docker Scout for security, Docker Build Cloud, um, and additional capabilities in Docker Desktop to kind of help stand up new use cases and new services. Um, Not to jump on the meme in the moment, and I know we're going to talk about this soon, but clearly in the last 24 months, helping developers be successful with AI in two different vectors. One, be successful um, building AI applications, so applications that are taking advantage of LLMs, but then also AI under the covers, how does it help developers to be more productive? And so Docker's been investing in both of those for the last 24 months. And you're seeing a lot of that in the last 6 months or so come to market. Things like MCP support native in Docker Desktop as well as Docker Hub. You're seeing it come to light in agents that are embedded throughout the product line, whether it's the command line, desktop, on the website, web properties, to help developers discover containers, use Docker most effectively to help them create with simple language Docker files that have all the best practices built in terms of layering, best practices around security, smart defaults in the Docker file. Same thing with Docker Compose files, and so. Um, I guess that's both a breadth and depth answer, right? So build out additional build out of services around the SDLC inner and outer loops, and then within those services, particularly investments in AI to help developers and frankly democratize Docker to make it easier for developers who might not be Linux gurus, right? Who might not know the command line, who might not want or might not know Bash and thus understand Docker files so thoroughly, help them take advantage of the product and all the power of the product as well.
Then come 2021, ChatGPT comes along, right? And it just changes the way people think about software, right? Early kind of use cases, if you see, it was like mostly conversational stuff, right? Like, and even those kind of conversational bots, like, it was night and day difference between what was there before and what was the world after ChatGPT came about. However, like, I think in the early days, there was still a lot of hallucinations, and that has not completely gone away. And developers try to use this, and instead of going and while you're doing development, like right before the ChatGPT days, it was like, hey, I need to know how to use this library. You go and go to Stack Overflow and find out examples and use them. And now you had this interface via ChatGPT, which would essentially behind the scenes was going and figuring out like everything, and then presenting you a piece of code that you can go and start and build and start and execute. But the hallucinations made it harder and harder to do that. Like, but the way people, and I think Cursor has come and changed a little bit of that, right? Like, not like it's not trying to say give it a. It is trying to think of a way, mold you into using it just like a developer would. Like, because as a developer, you would never write a piece of code and just ship it, right? You write a piece of code, you test it locally, you'd give it to your peer
Mhm.
developers, they would code review it back and forth, and eventually it would get into a state where it's like, hey, now I can ship this, right? And that's also fundamentally changing the way developers are trying to build, test, and ship code. And then
100%.
right, and what's the role? How do you see this, like this big shift happening? It's still very early days, right? Like, tell me a little bit about like how you think things are going to change, and how this also affected more recent way people have been using containers at Docker as well, right?
Sure, sure. So maybe to start, there's two things that I think are pretty exciting right now. One is um, you're seeing the industry and developers themselves realize that Gen AI is more than just code completion, right? That there's more things that Gen AI can do to help developers, honestly, beyond just the IDE as well, right? Beyond just the text editor. There's tests to write, there's tests to validate, there's observability to instrument your application. There's CI and build to debug, right? And agentic AI and Gen AI is showing that it can be useful in those activities that are outside just writing code on the command line. And so um, I think the world's perspective and developers' perspectives is expanding quickly in terms of what this technology is capable of. Second is, which I think is also very exciting, and it's a little bit related, is that we are not we're in the midst of creating interfaces around the AI, not just for humans, but we're creating interfaces for agents, right? For automation. Because with the ability to spin up, tens, hundreds of agents per developer, per human developer, all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, what are the interfaces that those agents need in order to be successful? So in some sense, we talked about developer obsession as Docker's North Star from 2019. Developer obsession now includes not just the human developer, but the agentic developer as well. And what is that persona? What does that agent persona need in terms of interfaces, support, tooling, documentation, right? Go on down the list. Treat them like a first-class user and customer, but that's very different from a human developer, right? I think that's a really, really exciting evolution of our industry. And so look, I'm you, me, all of us deep in this, we're techno optimists, right? So I think this is a fantastic time for our industry, and the fears about replacing developers or developer jobs going away, I think it's unfounded. I think there will be a transitional period, as there always is with these technology shifts. But if you look over industry shifts over the history of hundreds of years of change, every time there's one of these industry shifts, it expands the market. It expands the demand for the value that market creates. While yes, having short-term transition periods that are not pleasant, that can be painful. So I think we're in a great time of market, and I think the Gen AI wave, it feels unlike any other wave that you and I have been participants in the past, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the biggest shifts in how people think about building code, building software. I think after the cloud, I think this big the cloud came out when AWS came out with this thing, right? I think this is a big shift in, and I think that's also changed the way how today's developers who come and start doing coding first time, that they even think about writing code, right? Like so, I think I started professionally started with C, right? And even when you could see, assembly blocks of code, within C codes, right? Like, and then you still had to
Yeah,
understand a little bit of what was going on there, right? And as a good programmer, you were expected to understand every single piece of line that was actually written there, like, and as a good programmer, you'd write something and run it at least once to the debugger, right? Like, that's kind of changed right now, right? When people think it's like this whole thing about vibe coding, you have an idea and you want to get it to production, you go and run this thing, you get a piece of code. Most likely, no one's running these things to debuggers, right? Like, hey, I think this works. Let me give it a few inputs, few outputs. It works, and then you hit production. Happy path is great. And when then things go wrong, eventually they will. The whole debugging scenario, because this
yeah.
is pieces of code that, yes, they actually check this piece of code in, but they haven't really written it from scratch and intuitively figuring out, hey, what is this thing doing. uh, how do you kind of see that coming along? On one side you want more adoption, more people to use. It's going to change the way people do things, but and then but understanding what you actually did, right? Like, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Um, And look, first off, to state the obvious, it's super early days, right? Like vibe coding as a term was coined in February. So what, 4 months
Exactly.
ago, right? So
Exactly.
so let's just all acknowledge that like 3 4 months
Right.
is a brief period of time in the history of our industry. But and it's moving quickly, right? And let's call out the good things first, right? Um, it does make tools like Bolt and Cursor Windsurf, it makes it much more accessible to a wider range of developers, or maybe even folks who have not traditionally considered themselves developers, right? And you can spin up prototypes and things that people can react to really, really quickly, and that's exciting. That helps increase the velocity of ideation, the velocity of feedback on a thing, right? And you've already said this, like, and if left unchecked, just pushing that through this SDLC into production is not going to end well for anyone, right? And so we're already seeing this realization of like, oh, great for prototype, great to bring many more personas that weren't classic developers along, right? Versus writing documents and waterfall and PRDs and design docs and all. It's like, no, let's get in and build a prototype. We're learning that like, oh, okay, well, maybe before we kind of go further, once we have the prototype, let's start going back to the agent and saying, hey, I want to see this with this type of architectural design principles, and please write unit tests and integration tests and end tests for me for this thing, right? So we are going to see a evolution, I'll say, of the current vibe coding moment that doesn't take away from the velocity and the democratization of participation from all these non-developer personas, which is very exciting, and okay, we need another layer or um, another cycle or round in the conversation that asks the agent to, okay, let's do our diligence and make sure that we're not going to put something in production that's going to result in a lot of pain for a lot of people. So it's early, but I think it's going in the right direction. And yes, part of learning is failure and learning from those failures and failing forward.
And then see, at least for me, right, like part of what excited me as a developer was the passion that you got around developing. And because see, end of the day, like I feel like software development coding is still an art, like, and when you do something and when you see that work, you get excited about it, like, and
Nothing better. Yeah.
right. But because you have put long hours into it, and now AI has obviously made it easier. You have an idea in mind, and you can take it to production very, very quickly, or you can see the piece of code that whether you write by hand or you partially wrote by hand, and what AI generated, like seeing it in live in production or in action is definitely very, very pleasing to have, right? But all of this has been trained. AI hasn't gotten good because there was like millions of lines of billions of lines of source code, billions of files on GitHub that was available that
Yeah.
ChatGPT could train on.
Yeah.
But now there is less and less of that happening, right? Like because the amount of new fresh code, the way people think about writing code, and I'll give you an example, right? If you remember like the whole MIT Hackman stuff, right? Like the need of the day was extremely low memory footprints, and then a lot of coding that goes in kind of bit mangling, like all of that stuff, which people don't do that today, right? Like after the C,
Right.
even early Java days, like I don't even know, like if Rust has like stuff around doing bit mangling, right?
Well,
Now,
wasn't there was an equivalent for Perl, right? Remember the Perl, like
yes,
make the most
exactly,
efficient single line of Perl? I
exactly,
remember those days where it's
yeah,
like, okay, this thing that no one else can read, but it can do everything, right?
exactly,
So,
right,
excuse me.
right, but uh, the the style of things that people write code also changed, right? But now there's less and less of that, right? Like and which means that is AI, yes, AI can learn from itself and do, but without like this human input on new types of ways to do things, right? Like do you think like we'll hit a roadblock, and any ideas on like how we can encourage people to still write code and then use and bring in the more of the creativity, right? Like and that's where AI is also going to get better, because in a sense AI is only as good as like the input from humans that it gets, right? Like yes, you can do all the
100%.
semantic data and all of those things, that those arguments are there, but tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're catching you're asking the question, which is really an industry question, right at the moment that is being where it's being asked across the industry, which is I'll say like where does the craft of development show up in these tools, and how does it show up in a way that enables those who are experienced software developers insert kind of their instinct and their knowledge and their craftsmanship, and then the flip side of that is if you're a young developer getting started, how do you develop that if the boilerplate kind of run rate code is now being automated away? Because I think the on ramp for juniors is an open question for our industry right now. That look, you and I both started when we both started, we were not tasked with the most creative, most difficult thing, right? When we started as developers, I was writing tests for Sun back in the day, right? Like it was very much the things that the senior developers did not want to do, and now that is stuff that the AI is doing. So, what is the on ramp for juniors? I think is a really good question and a foundational one. Um, but I will say, maybe going back to the vibe coding example, a senior dev with experience and knowing what's going on behind the scenes can give guardrails, guidance, instructions that I would assert still benefits from their craft. Now I'm a little bit over my skis at this point. I'm enjoying these tools like nobody's business, but I have not written production code in a couple of decades, right? So I'm a little over my skis in terms of talking about inserting craft today, particularly for front end frameworks, which are just bedazzling. How does that show up today in terms of what additional input and context a senior dev provides, I think that's the crux of your question. And I think we don't have an answer to that as an industry just yet. I'll say without that, it devolves because exactly as you said, this is trained on statistically, right? It's trained on average code, right? It's the bell curve or the normal distribution of code that's all been written in public repos across GitHub and whatever else. And no one wants to produce products that are average,
Yep.
right? No startup and no commercial business wants to produce an average product. And so that's where I think senior devs in particular have a role to play in like, okay, the common run rate stuff, the boilerplate stuff, fine. But there's an opportunity to add craft on top of that with the help of agents and AI, that'll differentiate and make a product stand out. And that gets to craft, that gets to intuition, that gets to understanding developer experience, that gets to understanding the problem that you're solving really, really well, and understanding the human you're solving it for really, really well. Which I would like to think most developers are going to embrace that and say, wow, those are exciting things that those are exciting muscles that I want to develop as well. So I don't have an answer for you, Ju. It's more what I'm observing and where I think we as an industry need to spend more and more time discussing and vetting and experimenting, frankly, to see how we ensure senior developer craft can still show up and differentiate these products that the bots are helping us create.
And then what role do you think like containers will play in this whole kind of new world of development, right? And then it's fast changing the way people think about writing code, right? Like, and what would be the role of containers moving forward, right? What are the things like that you already saw at Docker that you already started doing with the advent of AI, and then what are the big things on the horizon that containers can still do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, I mean, containers are the deployment unit of choice, right? They're the manufacturing unit, as we talked about earlier, and so they're not going away. What's changing is how are those containers formed? Before it was like most humans typing the code that then gets built into a container. Now it's humans and bots building the code that gets deployed into containers, and so it's more about the how than the change of the fundamental infrastructure. And if you look at all the AI applications that are being deployed today, they're all being deployed in containers. Now, what's exciting from an infrastructure standpoint is that there's a lot of work going on with our infrastructure partners, with Docker's infrastructure partners, to ensure those containers can take advantage of the hardware that's in these servers and in the laptops. So, hey, is there a GPU in there? Docker Desktop does this today. Is there a GPU in there? Oh, fantastic. Then if I've got an LLM sitting up here that could benefit from GPU acceleration, let me plumb into that infrastructure and dial in that GPU so you have faster LLM experience for the developer locally. And you can envision that happening across all hardware infrastructure. At the developer layer, this goes back to my previous comment about interfaces that are evolving, not just for human developers, but for agentic developers, agent developers as well. Um, a way in which you make containerizing your applications easy for bots to approach, so bots can easily kind of build code in containers without having to go down to the depths of C groups and namespaces. I think is really critical. And what you're seeing a lot of the industry do is put APIs in front of containerization. So specifically, there's a company called Test Containers, built by a company called Atomic Jar that Docker acquired a year or so, year and a half or so ago. And Atomic Jar Test Containers provides Java and like 13 other language interfaces that allow a developer to drive the stand-up creation of unit tests, run those tests, tear it down, all through kind of programmatic interfaces. And so that's an example of like, okay, take those programmatic interfaces, surface those to agents, and now agents can use container infrastructure to create the unit tests, write the tests, run the tests, look at the test results, tear it down, and rinse and repeat. And so I think it's about making the interfaces that humans have been comfortable with containers, making those interfaces apparent and obvious for agents to consume is where you see a lot of the development work going. And MCP is an early example of this, right? So MCP is now you can containerize MCP servers, make them discoverable by the agents up on Hub or wherever else you might have MCP servers, and then fire those up locally without having to set up a bunch of infrastructure for every server you stand up. If you can run containers, you can run any MCP server that's containerized in that environment. And so those are examples where you're seeing containers kind of play a major role in the agentic AI revolution that we're going through right now.
And then it's in a world where AI agents are writing code, assisting developers in writing code, managing infra. If you were to start Docker all over again, like, how do you build it differently? Or, I don't know if you have, after the whole kind of AI revolution came about, like, did you go back to like first principles thinking and saying that, hey, uh, we are doing it as a company right now, but, in the next few years, things are going to change. And then what were, has there been such an exercise, and can you give us some insights about into that?
Yeah, well, obviously, there's company internal and
Yeah,
external, so I can't speak too much in depth,
understood.
um, but the more one can make the interfaces to every layer of the containerized stack programmatic, the more you make it accessible to the AI. That's kind of point one. Point two is um, to your observation earlier, the the public code bases have resulted in, at least for the big foundational models, have resulted in kind of this bell curve normal distribution of average code. We recognize that early on, and in the AI work that we've been doing, we've been fine tuning. Docker's been fine tuning with its own internal data sets and understandings of how Docker works and what the error messages mean and what they lead back to. And so as a result, you're seeing in the Docker agentic experience much a higher quality, low hallucination, to use your word before, low hallucination results when it comes to Docker files and compose files, and how to set up a successful stack using Docker. And so I think, first principles would take you back to just get the basic interfaces right. And Docker is a beneficiary of like 11, 12 years of user data. That user data can be used to create or to inform these models to provide a much richer experience for developers than the run rate off the shelf models.
Yeah, that's right. And then the where do you see like vision of Docker going from here, right? Is it more of a platform like GitHub kind of a model, a utility like NPM kind of a model, or kind of hybrid of the two, right? Based on the last few years, the direction, like, what's been the organic fit that you've seen with the way Docker is been shaping?
Yeah, it's going to be more of a combination of the two. And the reason I say that is that the agents today know that Docker Hub is a rich source of components, right? So if an agent is out helping a developer build a 12-factor app or a microservices app, um, and the stat from even before agents showed up, before AI showed up, is like 90 some percent of any application is based on open source libraries. And the unique code that any commercial organization has is just about 10% of the app. Okay, so if 90% of your app stack is built based on open source components anyway, those open source components are being distributed through Docker Hub. Um, Content plays a huge role in this world that we're going forward. And so, how to ensure that agents are using trusted images, that they're using images that haven't been tampered with as they go from publisher to hub, from hub to the consumer. Like there's a rich surface area of content infrastructure that has been evolved and will continue to evolve to make sure agents are pulling the right package at the right time in the right part of the cycle. So that's one. The second is uh, more on the GitHub side in terms of the different stages of the SDLC. The SDLC is going to change, right? We see this happening in real time. Just an obvious statement, right? If the bottleneck to shipping an app formerly was the rate at which a developer could type into their IDE, I'm simplifying, right? But like if the IDE was the place where the developer sat, and most of the time in the IDE they're typing code, like that bottleneck is gone, right? That bottleneck is gone because now you've got code generation, code completion, you have agents. And so the SDLC and the developer within that SDLC, that world changes to where the developer is much more thinking about the target outcomes of the apps, how they're going to architect it, the things they need to build into it to make sure that it's a quality app when it goes to production, per our thread earlier. And so within that, the workload will continue to be the container. And so, okay, if that's the case, then as this SDLC evolves, those different stages are going to be stages that are involved manipulating, updating, inspecting, and creating containers. And so I shared earlier some of the Docker additional products that we had built around desktop. Those are going to evolve in in tandem or along with the workflows that we're seeing today evolve with Gen AI to continue to provide developers who are no longer sitting in their IDE for most of their day with experiences that help them build containerized applications. So anyway, long-winded answer, but it's a combination of both that you shared.
Will what will the role like see the world could go towards yes with AI making it easy to write code. It could be a world of serverless in the future, and containers are a neat way of packaging stuff, right? But going in that kind of pattern, like you could see that hey, I know what my container should look like. I know what things to pull in, but can you even run this for me, right? Like same angle of like, hey, you want to use AI to make it simple to write code, like make it easy to for simple for people to make it simple to run code as well, right? Like whether any fundamental changes in Docker saying moving towards cloud compute or primarily staying in the container management kind of area.
Again, can't reveal kind of internal stuff, but let's just first for a second think about what the agents are doing. The agents aren't just or what you want agents to do in this evolved or evolving SDLC, right? Agents aren't just generating and suggesting additional code or generating code. They are exploring multiple paths of code, and should changes be made to that code, what those changes imply in the dependencies throughout the rest of the code base. They're doing that all in parallel to the developer, right? So you have 10, 100, whatever agents in parallel running these paths, these branches in parallel. They don't want to stop there, right? They want to actually build and run the code and see what the effects are of these different paths they're making. Well, if you're building and running code, you want to build and run code in a safe manner and also in a manner that parallels the environment the developer is building in, because you don't want works on my machine finger pointing between agents and agents and agents to the developer. And so those running isolated environments is going to be really important at scale that are reflective of the developer environment and are not conflicting and also contain any particular malicious libraries or malicious attacks. That is a very rich environment, which we don't have today, right? And so you can imagine that being a rich source of innovation throughout the industry that any developer team and even an individual developer is going to want. They're going to want to have the power to fire up 1,000 agents and explore all these paths in parallel and with preemptive or predictive branching um, to get the most out of their agentic helpers that are around them. And that's pretty exciting.
It is, and it's and the world is also fast changing. You mentioned hey, the whole vibe coding thing just came a few months back, right? But 6 months later, what's going to come? Like what these models are going to be capable of. Like quantum computing comes into the picture. Like things are going to change very very rapidly, right? I think it's probably the most exciting time to be in the industry at this point.
Oh yeah, I mean, disruption can be a little nerve-wracking, right? But disruption leads to opportunity. And I'm with you, Drew. I think it's like the best time to be building in our careers. And
Yes.
this is someone who's seen like 3 or 4 or 5 different stack transitions in my career, and yet this is one of the most exciting.
And back to a little bit about your kind of personal leadership style, right? Like you stepped into the CEO role when around the time it was a very very difficult phase for the company. You're also a first time CEO, right? Like you'd been the chief operating officer before, so you probably been there along with the leadership team. But how was the pressure like? You mentioned earlier that it was a very difficult phase in the company, right? How was the pressure like? And not just managing the team, but managing the board. There's an open source community. Like talk to me a little bit about the pressure. Like some, if you have some great examples, some great stories to share during those times, it'll be good learnings for people who are first time CEOs, for example.
Sure, sure. And um, at the end of the day, this is a team sport, right? And the CEO's job is to pull together the team and lead through ups and downs. And so I'll just give you an example. When we announced the split, as we called it in 2019, um, the press lit up and declared Docker is dead. Docker's never going to recover. Got trumped on by Kubernetes years ago. Splitting the company apart is a mistake. All this. And if you go back and Google in time and look at the headlines from November 2019, December 2019, like everyone declared us dead. And so it takes a great deal of I'll say calm and take a lot of deep breathing to stand back and help one's team um, understand that no, we actually see a huge opportunity here, and here's why. Like, you should ignore the headlines, right? Because the headlines and every, they're I'm sure their partners and significant others were telling them like, "Are you crazy? Like, get out of there." And so what that required is myself and my leadership team really looking at each other and saying like, let's band together. We're here because we believe. Let's band together and let's just really communicate authentically, kind of mistakes we made in the past, um, where we missed some market turns, and on top of that, authentically why we're excited to be here and why this is a huge opportunity and everyone's role who was still at the company at the time, everyone's role in making that opportunity real. And I think by spending a lot of time, first off, with each other as a leadership team, and then with the rest of the employees there, that was a big part of um, helping everyone and as individuals and as a company take a breath with all this negativity hitting them from the outside and say like, no, like we can do this. We have a great brand. We have developers that love the product. We have additional adoption and consumption metrics that are going up and to the right without us doing anything. So now it's our job to like focus on that, unlock that potential that's there, and in doing so, we're going to make this a great company, a great business, and then every day come back to that. Every day, come back and show progress. Every day, when you make mistakes, come back and acknowledge those mistakes. And I think that was a big part of helping us lead through the first year. Another one of our virtues, maybe to underscore this point, was um, humble confidence, meaning that everyone has something to learn, everyone has something to teach, everyone has something to contribute, everyone has something to be gained by that contribution, and by acknowledging that everyone can approach this new opportunity with humble confidence, confidence in what we've built, confidence in where we're going, but humility to like acknowledge that we can be wrong, to listen to the market, to listen to developers, to listen to each other, um, was part of that balance that, and very importantly, in that first year, in bringing everyone through and emerging, we emerged from the first year beating our numbers across user adoption, beating our numbers from a revenue standpoint, and really giving people a confidence like, oh, okay, this is working. Yeah, yeah, I want to stay and keep contributing.
And then you mentioned it. You took around a year for it to kind of go over that phase, right? Like, but at some point, you know that hey, the worst is over, right? Like, it's only uphill from here. You're building on something that you have helped the company transition. Outside of the revenue numbers and developer downloads, what were kind of some intrinsic signals from within the company? Because end of the day, company is only as good as the employees in the company, right? Like, what were some signals that you picked up from internally from in the company? Say like, hey, this is the new Docker, right?
Yeah, yeah, and well, I'll back up a step and I'll say at least my stance was only the paranoid survive, and so we never shifted to a gear of like, oh, we got this. Like, yeah, like this isn't our, our dominance is inevitable. We never allowed that mindset to creep in. I firmly believe like the minute you think you got this and you know everything, like you're dead, right? And so we try to stay hungry, stay again humble confidence, stay focused on the customer, stay listening to the market, stay paranoid, healthy paranoid about potential competitors or alternatives. So just to correct a little bit, like we never kind of crossed over and like, we got this, we're done. But maybe to give you an example of how we saw the culture evolving positively, such that we were confident the culture was going in the right direction. Again, you're never done with culture. Is We had a number of folks depart that first year, but then we started seeing folks come back. We called them boomerangs, and folks who would leave, and then we'd come back 6 months, 9 months, and they'd say, "Wow, culture that we have here at Docker is really special. The humble confidence, the developer obsession, and I wasn't finding that in the place that I left." And so seeing the boomerangs, and it wasn't just one or two, it was like 10 plus, tens of plus boomerangs came back, uh, was a signal for us that we were on the right track and we needed to continue to evolve the culture in the direction we were going.
Well, and what's next for you right now? Like, you talked about, hey, this never a great time to build than right now, right? Like, what's next for you? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth. It's never been a better time to build. I still agree with that. And after 11 years at Docker, 5 as CEO, I need to spend time with my family. So I've committed my family to take some time off. I have been taking some time off, and my kids are teenagers and spending more time with them, and because they've only known 11 years of Docker when Dad wasn't around that much, unfortunately. So I'm trying to make up for some lost time, which is a lot of fun. And when they're at school, I've been going deep in AI during most of my days, and boy, it's so much fun. There's been so much going on these last couple of years in terms of moving the state of the art forward, and not just for the industry overall, but in particular for developers. And then I've also been giving back to my community in the afternoons, which has felt really good just to stand back and realize just how incredibly fortunate we are to be in such an exciting industry at this time in our careers, at this time in our lives. And so, yeah, I am itching to get back, but I'm gonna finish taking a breath first before I get back to it.
Cool. Thanks, Scott. That was wonderful, exciting conversation. Thanks for being at the show, sharing your experiences. And at some point in time when you're ready for something else, that's probably a story for another day. We'll probably have you happy to have you back on the show again.
Thanks, Drew. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Cool. Thanks, Scott.